you, let me just give you a short introduction, and then I want to introduce Andrew. But the Sophia Center is relatively new. It's a fast-growing community. I'm kind of amazed, actually, at how quickly it's growing. I'm thrilled with that. We're focused on the integrative studies of psyche and soul, and in bringing, like we're going to be doing in these conversations, bringing a psychotherapeutic ideas to socio-political challenges. So really, it's an interdisciplinary and an integrated connection. And part of that vision and mission includes a democratization of epistemologies. And what I mean by that is it's not only the intellectualizing and the theorizing, it's also bringing in the arts and the artists and understanding that from the perspective of the creative unconscious that Jung wrote about, that Neumann writes so much about, and recognizing the intuitive, all these different ways of knowing are equally valid, equally credible, and in times like these especially, I believe, equally important. And so I'm still admitting people who are coming in late to class here while I'm talking to you, so forgive me. So I want to say thank you to a couple people. I want to say thank you to Shaler Wright, who I think is on with us this morning, who is the Director of Community Engagement, and also to Sandy Salzillo, who's a clinical advisor, and Elizabeth Nelson, who is kind of an editorial advisor, for their help and their expertise. And then to many of the faculty, we continue to have faculty from all around the world join us and be a part of this vision and mission to do that. So Andrew, thank you, my friend. And you are up at bat. Let me just lob this first question to you, okay? So why that piece of music? Leonard Cohen, you know, I knew what I was probably setting myself up for when I said you get to choose, right? I didn't edit your choice. So, you know, why that piece of music for this discussion on COVID and the apocalypse?
Well, it's not surprising that Leonard writes about death, decay, destruction, and disaster. But it's really interesting that he sings about the future. You know, we are all terrified of death at the moment. And when you're facing death and thinking about death, paradoxically, you think about the future. And so I wanted a song, I wanted a piece of art that spoke about the future. And then, and this is a typical Andrew comment, it's a kind of crowd pleaser to have Leonard Cohen. That's my honest answer. Okay, for this question you lobbed at me without warning.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you for that. Okay, so let's start with this. You know, you've written substantially about the therapist as activist, and you've been a trailblazer in advocating for this orientation that in many ways flies in the face of a more traditional orientation of you know, neutrality, clinical neutrality. Can you define for us, what do you mean by this therapist as activist for those who might not be familiar with your body of work, and why are you such a fierce advocate for this?
Well, the main schools of therapy have been involved with politics since the very beginning. So perhaps this is an academic sounding point, but whether it's psychoanalysis, Jungian analysis, humanistic and bodily and transpersonal psychotherapies, in a way, it's not new. And my generation of therapists who think about politics has been very active. And I'm not the only one. I'm thinking of Lynn Layton in the United States, Susie Orbach in the UK, and there are many others that one could think about or name. The big point is, in the therapy room, as in the world, what links us is being in the same society. When we talk about how therapist and client communicate, we tend to use jargon, unconscious to unconscious communication. Actually, it's really more of a social matter. But being in the same society definitely doesn't mean experiencing it in the same way. That's why this phrase, we're all in this together, is obnoxious and ridiculous. Nevertheless, the fact that we do experience the social world differently doesn't mean that we're not all in it. I don't think it's just psychoanalysis or the traditional therapies that have been a bit frightened of forcing the client to think politically in the same way that the therapist does. I think there has been a sort of tenderness even, or delicacy behind what seems like a real resistance for engaging in politics. Terrible fear of either losing your client because you can't agree, or of forcing your client into your own mold. This isn't necessary. If you're working in the area of spirituality or aggression or personal relationships, family dynamics, you're not so worried about foisting your own views on your client, but when it comes to politics, you really are. I think we in the therapy world are recognizing that our clients are activist clients in two senses. Firstly, they are activist in their own therapy. They know a lot. Even people who are claimed to be very disturbed, or such phrase, they know a lot. And they can be active if we facilitate it. The days of the all-knowing therapist, the one who's supposed to know, they're really totally gone. And they are activist in another way. There are buried political passions in many clients, not all, but enough. I don't think that therapy over the decades has brought that out very much. So to pull that answer together, it ain't new, but it has reached its moment. You know, in the therapy world, we talk about the relational turn, meaning that the therapy relationship is the most important thing. I'm not sure it's true, by the way, and that's for another day. But we need to add to the relational turn something called the political turn. The therapies are irradiated by the polis, and at a time like this, with an international crisis, it seems to me appropriate that this political turn be recognized, celebrated, taught, encouraged, and so on.
Okay. All right. So, the days of the all-knowing therapist are gone. You're mentioning in that. I mean, which is interesting. I don't know that everyone's on that bus yet, Andrew. And let me ask you this. And again, here's another unscripted question. You can, yeah, we can talk about it later. But in times like this in particular, don't you think there's even more of a scenario where the client is looking for the analyst to be all-knowing because things are in such upheaval? And how do you work with that? How do you manage that?
Well, if you pick that up in a client, then I think you have a responsibility to play that back to the client. Mm-hmm. You are expecting something from me, and I might disappoint you. Mm-hmm. I might fail you. Mm-hmm. I may not be able to give you what you want. And by the way, that will be an attitude to political leadership at the moment, which I expect we'll talk about later. Oh, how I yearn for a political leader, especially in my own country, Britain, today, who could say, I actually don't know. Hmm. So I think that there is a moment around.
Yeah, so that there's a degree of vulnerable honesty and not allowing or accepting the projection of infallibility or omnipotence that might be there. Okay, so let's go to this next question. There have been a lot of conversations online, primarily linking COVID with the apocalypse, hence part of the impetus for your title for this. Therapists have been talking about client presenting dreams full of apocalyptic symbols. I'm reminded of what Yolanda Jacoby writes when she writes this: as soon as an individual is threatened with the danger of isolation, there is a compensatory increase in the production of collective archetypal symbols. And in your book, A New Therapy for Politics, you write this: a level of affect is achieved that turns mere events into what can justly be called archetypal, or at least numinous experiences. Do you think that's what we're experiencing now? How do you understand this constellation seemingly of apocalyptic symbols, and how do you work through this?
there is no apocalypse, okay? Just because one uses the word doesn't mean one is saying this is the case.
Mhm.
There is a crisis. There is no apocalypse. But the idea, the image, the metaphor of the apocalypse is very powerful. That's why I coined this awful word, apocalypticism, which I see as a problem. This is what happens when fear of an end, equivalent to apocalypse, colonizes the mind. It paralyzes the capacity to act. But there's something even more subtle, even more dangerous, and even more buried that I think needs to be named. A lot of people secretly are fascinated, obsessed, seduced, involved in the idea of an apocalypse because it's a very interesting and neat way to stop thinking politically, to stop thinking in terms of action. If there's no future, well, fuck it. It really doesn't matter what happens. And I think that idea is around. And I also think this idea of fuck it, there's no future is around, this is just my guess, in groups of people who don't speak much, who don't have access to interviews like this, who are not interviewed like this. So I think we are talking about a secret desire that, if unaddressed, will hamper political change. Of course, it's my own fault that I was heard as saying there will be an apocalypse. I'm actually saying the opposite.
The opposite.
There won't be a bloody apocalypse, but there is something that leaches out, bleeds out from the idea of an apocalypse that gets into the mind and does screwy things to it. So when I'm working clinically, I have these thoughts in mind, but I'll leave that answer out there just as it is.
So, you know, where you're going with this, I mean, yeah, you mentioned the fear and the paralysis and inability to act with this overwhelming fear, but even underneath that, where you're going with this is almost that idea of the apocalypse as a form of escapism, as an absolution of personal responsibility. Is that accurate?
That's my front door.
All right, so for those of you sitting on with us, we'll wait while Andrew answers his front door, but something to be thinking about and maybe composing a question.
No, I'm back.
Okay, so did you get that last piece, the apocalypse as escapism? We're going to leave, we're not going to edit this out of the video. This is just kind of what makes it.
No, leave it in.
It's worth the price of admission, Andrew.
That might well be the Grim Reaper at the door. Or all four of the riders of the apocalypse. They're paying us a visit.
As long as they don't come 4 times, Andrew. This is only a 1-hour session, so.
Yes.
All right, so.
I've dealt with them.
Okay.
However, I think that Shakespeare got this better with Hamlet. Why is it so attractive? Why is it so powerful? Because archetypes are not always positive. They can be negative. They can actually be neutral. Hamlet, speaking of the end, said, to die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep, to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. That's our problem. He's got it right. We devoutly wish.
A consummation devoutly to be wished.
And it is causing us huge difficulties. Maybe we should move on from apocalypse.
Well, we can, but that's the theme for this session. So I want to put this out there as well for consideration. I mean, because ultimately the apocalypse, at least if we're looking at it from the perspective of the book of Revelations, is not about an end. It's about a beginning. It's about a new heaven and a new earth. So the ultimate, the ultimate trajectory for apocalypse is the end of heaven and earth as we know it, and the emergence of a new heaven and a new earth. So maybe something also to think about relative to this constellation of apocalyptic symbols.
It's up to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's up to us. That our future is not in the stars, but in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if what you just said is to come about, and we're going to discuss this in the rest of the interview,
Mm-hmm.
we have to do something.
Exactly. Exactly. So, all right. So let's go to the next question in this. COVID is being referred to as, quote, the great revealer, which, by the way, is also the etymology of apocalypse in the original Greek. It means a removal, a taking away of that which is hiding something. So COVID, in many ways and on many levels, is a great revealer. What do you see as being revealed in this pandemic, and how might the therapist as activist need to readjust to respond to these revelations?
I'll tell you what's being revealed. Power and privilege is being revealed. And actually, those are themes that if you dig, you'll find in Revelations as well. We are seeing an extraordinary revelation of the way power and privilege plays itself out through socioeconomic class, through sex and gender, through ethnicity, and many other pathways or channels. This is what's being revealed. If you take the socioeconomic structure of a country like Britain or the United States and you map it on to the structure of illness and death from COVID-19, the fit is perfect. It's clear that the main problem is the lack of equality in the Western world. And nowhere is this problem more clearly visible than in relation to leadership. I touched just now on the need for leaders who don't know, for cannot do, can't do leaders rather than can do leaders, for leaders who are experts in the management of failure, what some people listening to this will be sick of hearing me talk about as good enough leaders, using Winnicott's phrase, for all that the mother can be when confronted with her fallibilities and her offspring's judgment of her father's too, by the way. So that's also something that's being revealed. Add to power the problematic of leadership. And in many countries, people are beginning to get tired of loyally supporting their leaders. They're realizing that nothing is lost by facing the disappointment that the failures of leaders builds into us.
So they're waking up, do you think, globally, or because here in the United States, and this is just my opinion and my observation, but it feels like we're still looking for that hero. There's still that wanting to find that that hero that's just going to make it all right.
Yes, and this is actually a place where therapy thinking might be useful to decode and delve into the visceral, even sometimes genital desire for the strong heroic leader. In Brecht's play Galileo, the line occurs, "Unhappy is the land that has need of heroes." And next month, when I look at different ways citizens approach the viral crisis, I will try to say something a little bit more in depth about the problems with heroic leaders. But for the moment, I just want to leave it out there that I think in many countries there is a craving, even in countries that have done, as we say, well in relation to this virus. I think there is a craving for leaders who make space for the activity of citizens, just as there is a craving in the therapy world for therapists who make space for the activity of clients.
So, and maybe this is a different way of saying it, but that's part of the work we've been engaging with the Sophia Center as well, is this idea of an emerging model of leadership and a more nuanced and diverse understanding of hero that is not simply mired in a patriarchal, the hero's journey, but that is more inclusive and the ability for a leader to fluidly move between both the traditionally understood hero's journey and a more, some would say feminine, you can call it what you want, but a different understanding of what leader is. And that's probably going to take us into next month's session.
I understand.
Yeah. Okay. So there have been also a lot of conversations. We've all been a part of them. We're all on Zoom. We're living on Zoom. Editorial Zoom summits regarding the, and I'm using quotes here, the new normal. It's almost like a type of seize the day philosophy, that suggests that we can maximize the momentum of this pandemic, or, capitalize on it in a sense to fast forward everything. From a liberal political agenda to a quantum leap forward in consciousness. What are your thoughts on this, Andrew? Is COVID offering an opportunity for change, a change in consciousness, as well as possible political structures? And can we change?
When you sent me your questions, I thought this was the most difficult one. Is COVID offering an opportunity for a change in consciousness? I have trouble with the language. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm a tight-assed, depressive Brit, an intellectual, a lefty, a materialist, and so on. But when I see changing consciousness, I reach for my gun. As Henry Ford said, I really don't feel okay about this. Even if there were a change in consciousness, which would take millennia, if that's mm-hmm. really what we're talking about, mm-hmm. consciousness is not necessarily the ground for political action. It may be somewhere there at the back of the collective mind. But there's far too much self-congratulation when people talk about transformation and people talk about all the wonderful liberations that this global crisis will bring to us. Consciousness does not necessarily lead to political action. What does? What does have to change? There is going to be a God Almighty backlash against people like the Sophia Center, who say there could be a change in consciousness. The bankers are not interested in a change in consciousness, nor are the military leaders, nor are the conventional politicians, nor in fact a great many middle-of-the-road people who cannot stand the inflated language that not just Jungian psychoanalysis uses to struggle. That's what's needed. And what might happen, is that radical and progressive groupings from a wide range of activities might get together, whether people are interested in ethnic politics, economic justice, the climate crisis, changes in patterns of intimate relationships to do with gender, attitudes to the body, whatever it is that a group is involved in, is there a chance of a conversation? What used to be called a broad front or a united front. Now, the reason I like this is that it is extra parliamentary. It does not depend on who won the British election or who will win the American election or other elections. I think there are some political leaders, conventional political leaders, especially women leaders in Nordic countries, who might well facilitate something that would be outside the conventional politics that got them to the positions of power, influence, and leadership that they have. Now, to get to the punchline, did I mention therapists in all those groups? I should have. I usually do, and I'm doing it now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we should try to lead them. I think we should just join in a humble and accepting role and try to find alliances with all the kinds of progressive and radical groupings that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Again, people are sick of hearing me say this, but there are a lot of people here who probably don't know me. I would love for there to be a therapist on every committee or commission, but please, please, God, don't let us have a committee of therapists. Therapists are crap on their own. Look at our politics, look at the splits in therapy organizations and ideologies. We are useless, but we might have a role to play. You know, every committee needs a statistician, and they sit at one end of a spectrum. In Britain and other countries, we are seeing a lot of statisticians. Maybe therapists could be at the other end of the spectrum. So I think there is a role for what I call the psi world in the formation of a new informal kind of political gathering that is outside conventional electoral politics. And I think there are signs that it's happening. Rebecca Solnit wrote a very big piece in The Guardian about all the positives that are coming out of this, but she didn't write about this. She didn't write about the movement. I'm sorry to use an old 60s lefty term, but the old 60s lefty thinking is exactly what we finally need. There is a need for a movement. And I think therapists will have a tiny role in this movement.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hear you, and I totally agree with the need for a movement. And I hear your reaction to even using that term consciousness. And I think you bring up a really important point. Consciousness changes over millennia, not months, not years. And I'm seeing some of the people chatting on the chat bar and bringing up someone that we talked about in the first session, Jacinda Ardern, which, you know, is not about idealizing her or even idealizing women, but what there is emerging, and I think that's what you're talking about, is a political modeling that kind of offers new paradigms for understanding leadership and a good enough leader, and that breaks it out of the narrowly defined silo that we've always historically been given. And I don't think it's dependent on whether it's a woman or a man, whether you refer to consciousness maybe as a psychological orientation that it's able to break out of those silos and offer and be instrumental in setting up some of the, like, what would that look like, what you're talking about? It's wonderful to talk about therapists need to be a part of a committee, but what would that even look like? How would a therapist break into something like that? I mean, within their own communities?
It's a good question. And I like the cut and thrust. I'm projecting onto the purveyors of a changing consciousness, mm-hmm. which also needs to be owned by the idea of a broad front of radical and progressive forces. Nobody's solutions are perfect. Right. So I'm not saying I take it back. I'm more in favor of a radical and progressive broad front in the world of politics than I am in the language and epistemology of a changing consciousness. But you are right, you're very sharp, you're absolutely right. The same problem exists. What I've just said may simply be words, words, words. And I face this all the time. When I write or think or talk as a therapist about politics, it could just be words. It could be, as we say in Britain, a wank.
I don't even know what that means, but okay. Well, first of all, it's
a jerk off. A jerk off.
Okay. Okay.
However,
all right. I'm cutting you off there, Andrew. Okay, so hold on. Let me just go back to something. Okay, so first of all, what you're saying is a heck of a lot more than just words. You've lived this material, and I know just from what little I know of you that again, the generosity in offering it. It's far more than words. But I think what we're all sitting with and wrestling with relative to the brilliance of what you're talking about is, I think this is where this conversation is kind of going, is before there can be the political movement that you're talking about in the minds and psyches of those individuals, whether they're revolutionaries or rebels or both, right? There has to be a change from the traditional conception of business as usual.
yes, I hear you, but you're maybe not quite getting my anxiety. I look into the abyss of it all being nothing much more than words, words, words. And I think it's a good discipline. Maybe we should move on.
Yeah, well, I hear you. I hear you on that abyss, but I think that there's hope, and we'll get to that in the next in one of your next questions. Your whole take on hope.
Isn't there an expression in American slang? Where's the beef?
That was an old commercial. Yeah, where's the beef? All right. Well, we're going to keep talking. Maybe we'll get to where's the beef. All right. So, and this next question kind of speaks to this. The kind of change a lot of people are talking about is transformational change, right? And I think you kind of just leaned into this a little bit with, some frustration with the way in which we throw that word around out there, transformational. Not simply political readjustment. You've written about the necessity of sacrifice for this kind of political structural change. What do you see as being some of the necessary sacrifices in order to facilitate it?
Well, I'm asking a question when I write about sacrifice. What degree, in particular, of economic sacrifice is possible? And I began to talk about this firstly in relation to the climate crisis, when nobody knew where Wuhan was. Mm-hmm. And I think that the question of sacrifice, the giving up of something in order to get something, is worth thinking about from a psychological point of view. Jungian psychology, I don't know about psychoanalysis, but well, I do know about psychoanalysis, and I actually think they don't do this. I think in the Jungian canon, the idea is that the ego has to be sacrificed for something bigger, deeper, higher, more interesting, less everyday. And that is a sacrifice because it takes a person to the brink of madness, as it did with Jung. Jung was not mad, actually, but he became close to a psychosis. This is a long time ago, the time of the start of just before the First World War. So I do think that the yielding up of the everyday consciousness of the ego is important. Artists, whether they are performance artists, whether they are photographers, whether they are painters, they know that when they're in process, something is sacrificed. Often their relationships or marriages are sacrificed on the altar of their commitment to their art. And in religions, not just the Abrahamic religion, sacrifice is fundamental as a form of propitiating the gods. For me, the image of sacrifice that still works comes from 1969, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, and a 21-year-old student called Jan Palach poured a can of gasoline on himself and self-immolated. He wasn't the only person in recent history who's done it, but it's very powerful for me, including that he was so young. I don't see any kind of political change without an engagement with sacrifice. And here, again, I think therapists have a few things to say.
So what in particular would you say therapists have something to say relative to this? I mean, I love that you're bringing in the orientation of the artist, which the artist knows when you walk into the studio, when you walk into that, it's not just the possibility, as Jung often wrote about the artist, Jung idealized artists in some ways, but what you're really sacrificing in order to engage in that process is the right to egoic control. There's a type of surrender that happens psychologically for an artist to really get to that place where the dancer is danced. Where do you see that, or how might that need to happen in the therapist scenario?
I'm going to duck the question because we're running out of time. You put it very well. You put it very, very well that artists know about that loss of control when things are really hot.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. For another session, because I'm just watching conversations happening on the chat bar. So if you're wanting to go there, come back, because we will dive into this more deeply in another conversation.
Yeah. I
Okay.
think we should. Yeah.
One more question, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. Okay. Last question. In A New Therapy for Politics, in your book, you make what I think is just a really profound point about hope mandating an embrace of risk. In order for hope, there has to be an embrace and integration of risk. Can you speak to that? How do you understand that relationship, and what might that look like?
Before I answer the question, I want to say that for me, the center of these discussions is economics, wealth, income, class, and in particular, I think there is a question about taxation in most Western countries, and maybe in all countries. And this is a risk-taking thing that governments have to do. Mm-hmm. Not just help people who've lost their jobs by schemes that are probably going to end in a few months' time. And what happens then, nobody knows. But I do think that there is a chance to agitate for a fundamental redistribution of wealth. And that is a very risky thing. Now, to get back to risk. Risk, the etymology of risk is running towards danger, not walking or ambling or just gently moving towards it. It means actively running towards danger. Is this going to lead to us seeing citizens in the streets? I believe so. I think that there is a massive amount of rage that is being developed. I feel it, but there is a massive amount of rage being developed. Now, some of this is, if you like, it's escapist. People are enraged because an invisible killer stalks the lands of the earth, but that's really not the most important thing here. The rage is about what is being revealed, to use your academic and correct understanding of the etymology of apocalypse. What is being revealed is the complete dedication to inequality in most countries. Sometimes you'll hear psychological folks saying, well, of course, people are naturally, when you hear the word naturally, be careful. People are naturally thinking about their children, about the future, and all of that kind of thing. Well, yes, sure they are, but there may be another way to take care of your children's future than via inherited wealth. I'm sorry that this is going to sound a little bit socialist, but I am more than a little bit socialist. The biggest risk is if we do not tackle the question of economic inequality, injustice based on inheritance. We have to somehow, and I think therapists could start to model it or to think about it, because we don't know the answer. We do have to start to think about undoing the straitjacket of inheritance and especially the current tendency, which you can read about in The Economist, for rich people to marry one another. It's just making it worse and worse. And rich people get rich partly because they depend on the societies, the infrastructure, the resources that all of us have contributed towards. So, if you like, there is a risk that we don't attend to it. And that is what business as usual would look like. The continuation of the pattern in Western countries of the last 40 years, in which the gap between the rich and the poor gets ever bigger.
Mm. Okay, and we'll get to another conversation because we don't have time in this one. You said something really striking in this, that, yeah, it needs to, and probably, in your opinion, will get to that point with people in the streets. That goes to some of, one of your themes relative to political violence, and, the need for that. We can talk about that perhaps in another session. Andrew, I think these are huge questions and huge topics, and I can tell by everyone there's a number of ancillary conversations happening on the chat bar. I'm going to ask people to really lean in to this conversation, and instead of engaging in independent conversations right now. We've got about 7 minutes left, and I want to open this up. So I am going to see, hopefully I can view the chat bar because there's so many people on. Let me just see and ask you to pose a question for Andrew, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can. So anyone with a question for Andrew based on this conversation of COVID and the apocalypse and any of the themes, which there have been some.
Well, Loralee, I can see some really important and interesting and fantastically difficult questions, sometimes from people I know. Can I look at some of them?
Yes, feel free to look at them and address anything you want.
Yeah, Gillian Proctor from the north of England says, and our social experience is very changed currently. Our habits are very different. Does that not immediately change consciousness? I think it changes attitudes, assumptions, hopes and aspirations, Gillian, but to say that it changes consciousness is, to disagree mildly, it's premature. And I'm not sure, because when the backlash comes and all the old things that you and I don't like are restored, is that going to change consciousness back? I suppose I could find common ground with this word consciousness. I'm thinking aloud here, so bear with me, everybody. It may well be that consciousness is fashioned dialectically. It's fashioned out of conflict in the mind. So that consciousness that involves working with and appreciating the spirit of change and the gravitational pull of the old order, maybe that is where consciousness could be found. Keith Sylvester, also British, maybe change precedes imagination too. And I think that is really interesting, Keith. I think that what's happening in the arts is particularly interesting at the moment. I mean, I know the arts and the imagination are not the same thing, but they are linked. And I do think there is a stimulation of the imagination that is going on as we struggle with the chaos. And actually, chaos is another word that seems to me to be very important. This is not an orderly matter, and my thinking isn't orderly, nor do I impose one particular psychological theory or model onto everybody. I think it is confusing. I'm just going around. Why apologize, Andrew, says my friend Susie Orbach, who I name-checked earlier. There is such evidence, Piketty or Wilkinson, the spirit level, And then what about Mr. Karl Marx? Yep. But you see, Susie, it is a question of context. If we are with our friends, our comrades, there wouldn't be any need to even discuss it. The economic substratum of everything that we're talking about and what's been revealed about it and has been understood, I think, in a fresh way. I think what's being revealed about it and understood in a fresh way underscores that fundamental economic aspect. But I am on a lot of groups, a lot of Zooms, a lot of Google groups, and I read The Guardian all the time. And The Guardian isn't talking very much in the language of Thomas Piketty or of Wilkinson, Richard Wilkinson, and so on. They are not talking about, for example, tripling inheritance tax, which, as you know, is a big thing for me. And therapists, on the whole, duck money. I mean, they duck money as much as they duck sex. Actually, they duck money more than they duck sex, and they duck both more than they duck spirit. But anyway, that's a bit of a rant. I'm just looking because it's impossible that there are about 200 questions here.
I know.
To get to any, this is really interesting. Evie, to get to any change in economy, there is a need for good education. Education must be the beginning. I won't answer that. I just leave it out there. It's a thought for everyone. Someone else, Karen Adler, can Andrew reframe his ideas of sacrifice in economic terms? Delighted. I've already delivered a panegyric to increasing inheritance taxes and all kinds of taxes. And I hope that therapists can join in breaking the iron hold inheritance and what is alleged to be concern for children has on Western societies. So I think that there is going to be a discussion about sacrifice. Her Majesty's Treasury in Britain has produced a series of papers, all of which have been leaked. Everything is leaked these days, thank goodness. And one of them that has been immediately recalled, withheld, smeared, does talk about redistribution of wealth. If what has been shown to be the inequality, whether it's ethnic or gender or actually between nations, if that inequality wakes us up in a new way, not a World Bank way or an IMF way or a European Central Bank way, but in a way closer to what I imagine many people who are online at the moment would like. If that could happen, it would be great. By the way, I thought we were going to go along a bit longer than the 5 o'clock because of the music.
We can, because there's so many great comments, and thank you everyone for the comments here on the chat. So if people are in there with us, we can go a little bit longer.
Okay, here's Marie-Laure Umari from France. The backlash will be when we realize that there is no after, and that the same interests have been actually reinforced throughout the pandemic time. That at least is the tragic case in France. Well, Marie-Laure and I have been emailing about this very point. There is no after. All that's happened is that the shit that was there before has simply become a little higher octane. I'm not sure it's quite as depressing as that, Marie-Laure. I think that there is a recognition, even in The Guardian, that it's time to do something about inequality. And I think that the climate change activists have a lot to say about this, because if patterns of extraction, production, and consumption are going to change, then one way to manage the outcome is to find good ways of thinking about equality and inequality. It's so difficult because some of you I know. Well, Robert Downs. Oh, blimey, Robert. Bloody hell. What is in the way of the gathering of the multitude in your view? What are we compelled by to not gather on the streets to disrupt the neoliberal feudalism that is on the cards? Well, mate, we have to go on the streets. I don't quite know how you go on the streets and do a demonstration with social distancing, but I dare say a way can be found. There are lots of big streets. I think that it's amazing that the only public demonstrations that I know of, and I might be wrong about this, folks, I'm sorry, but the ones that get written up are the ones that are opposing lockdowns in the name of a kind of right-wing story of liberty and libertarianism and that kind of thing. I haven't seen yet, but I'm stand to be corrected, many demonstrations that say we want a different future, no return to business as usual, no normality. There may be, but there haven't been a lot. So that's a partial answer to a very complex question. Sulagna in India, that is exactly where activists are working now. Is there a transformation of consciousness in that work? If activists get together, then I don't think we need worry about this vexed question of whether it involves a change in consciousness. If activists get together, activists get together. Why give it a portmanteau overarching term like change in consciousness or transformative consciousness? I think activists are getting together. And by the way, at the heart of a great deal of the existing rejection of a return to normality is the work and thought of indigenous peoples, because they know about inequality. They know about how external forces ravage cultures that were perfectly okay before those forces arrived on the scene. And in a lecture I give on apocalypse, one of the main images I use is that of Native Americans protesting against pipelines. But Australian Aboriginal leaders are doing the same thing. And my friends in Brazil tell me that the thinking coming out of Amazonia about pushing back on Bolsonaro, I think that too is an example of how activism is activism led by indigenous peoples is so important. And by the way, indigenous doesn't mean, and this is to the Jungians, it doesn't mean primitive. You can be a very sophisticated indigenous person. There is a contemporary indigeneity. You can see it in Africa. You can see it in Kerala, in India, actually, how the approach to the virus was done there. But in Africa, in particular, something fascinating is going on. Indigeneity does not mean traditional necessarily. Will the young people lead the revolution, says Maura Conlon McIvor. Well, yes and no. I mean, I hope there'll be some old people in it too. I mean, given that we're going to die anyway, we might as well die in a good cause. Sacrifice and courage. How and where do we need Mother Courage? Orla Crowley. You're in Dublin, aren't you? Courage, yes. That's why the risk thing comes in. In a way, the questions went a bit wonky because Loralee and I got off on dialogue and we used our time. But risk is essential to hope. If we want to think about what might be hopeful in the situation we're in now, we have to think about the courage that would inspire facing risk. Winston Churchill, who is not a hero of mine, said that courage is the virtue that guarantees all the other virtues. And actually, it may be true right now. And those of you who are going to Google things after this should Google Maya Angelou on courage and Dr. Martin Luther King on courage. I can't summon it up now. Shall we just do two more and then pack this up?
Yes, Andrew, thank you.
I think donating money to lobbying groups is one way of acting that can be done while staying at home. Which lobbying groups is the question here? I don't think I don't think we're talking about putting money into this. I think money is always useful, but I think we're talking about other kinds of organizing. I'm sort of back with the thought that came to me, completely unrehearsed thought. And I repeat, there may well be demonstrations against normality and business as usual on the streets. There may well be, but if they're not, let's think about setting one up. From Carberry Neil, I don't know where you are. Could COVID be forcing a new way? Instead of going to the streets, we are joining in force from our homes on Zoom, but the question is, where do we go to here? Where do we go from here? We went to streets in the 60s. Now we are coming back together in our clans. I'm going to take this question as posing a huge problem. I mean, you can do therapy on Zoom or Skype. I think you can certainly have an orgasm via therapy, that's a good slip, via Skype or via Zoom. But I do not know if you can make a political revolution in my language or a transformation in consciousness in Loralee's language on Zoom. So I think that the first risk is the risk of infection. Well, actually, the risk of police forces telling you you can't go on the streets. But I don't think that a Zoom revolution is really possible. And this may be where the young people, to go back to the question that I didn't give a very good answer to, this is where the young people may come in. You know, I don't know about countries other than the ones I hear about, mostly Britain and America, but young people are breaking the lockdown rules left, right, and center. Good. I mean, it's not good in one way, but it's good in another way, because if we are talking about these ideas, which are by no means my possession, if we are talking about these ideas being heard, then somebody has to take the risk, somebody has to incarnate the hope, somebody has to display the courage of getting off Zoom and into lived experience in society.
Andrew, thank you, thank you, thank you. This was a intense Saturday late afternoon for you. Thank you to everyone who's been so engaged. You know, so many of you from different countries. This is to be continued, this conversation. So we will be back with Andrew at the end of June for Citizens in Viral.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
To remind everyone that soon they will get a link to the recording of this.
Yes, yes. Yes, the recording of this will be available within about 48 to 72 hours, and you will all be emailed a link to it. It'll be available on the Sophia Center website, and it will be on there for an indefinite period of time. So you can feel free to go back and watch, or to share or invite others to watch. And then we will be back again with Andrew the end of June, June 27th, for Citizens in Viral Crisis: Heroes, Siblings, Ostriches, and Good Enough. Andrew's title. So some of the themes that we didn't really have an opportunity to dive into deeply in this discussion will be part of that conversation. And in closing, I was going to read one of your quotes, but Andrew, I think I'm going to I'm going to go to Camus for closing. I don't think you'll mind that, for just a closing quote, and a thank you again to you for your continued work and commitment to this, and to everyone on here who I know is so invested in doing this kind of work around the world. Camus has this to say: in order to exist, man must rebel, but rebellion must respect the limits that it discovers in itself, limits where minds meet and in meeting begin to exist. So thank you, Andrew, and everyone, for a virtual meeting of the minds in this conversation. Much more to come. Thank you all. Have a wonderful Saturday afternoon, evening. Andrew, thank you. Thank you. Be well all. Be healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye.